All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking an incredibly multi-layered story surrounding Kyle McLean Smith's ongoing legal crusade. What makes this so fascinating is how it moves from his deeply personal struggles to recover his own estate all the way to a systemic campaign against the very foundation of Canadian property laws. We're looking at a technologist who is actively trying to re-engineer legal accountability from the ground up, starting with his own lost property.
To map out this incredibly complex narrative, we're going to hit four main stops. First up, a fight for the estate. Then, ongoing legal battles, followed by Canada's property rights gap. And finally, proposing a charter challenge.
So starting right at the foundation. Section 1, a fight for the estate.
Before we even get into the weeds of constitutional law or computer architecture, you really have to understand Kyle's intense personal drive here. The raw emotional stakes are perfectly captured in his own words. He says, quote, "I'm in it to win it or die. I'm okay with bankruptcy because compared to what I've already lost, it's just consequences," end quote. We're looking at a guy dealing with severe personal hardship. He actually describes himself as a political refugee operating from a place of profound loss when it comes to his family. Because he's sacrificed so much, traditional financial threats like bankruptcy, they just don't hold any power over him anymore. It's really the foundational baseline for everything he does next.
And this leads into his core philosophy, which is surprisingly simple: address the estate and all else will heal. You see, he firmly believes that restoring his family and his personal estate is the absolute necessary first step to resolving the chaos in his life. He flat out refuses to separate his grand technological visions from this deeply personal mission. Everything he builds is intrinsically tied to getting his estate back. Why? Well, to him, the estate isn't just physical property or cash in the bank. It's the ultimate proof of identity, stability, and legal recognition. If the estate is secure, the individual is secure. Without it, he argues, you're just left entirely vulnerable to systemic failures.
Which brings us to Section 2, ongoing legal battles.
Because of that immense vulnerability and exposure in his personal life, Kyle demands absolute rigidity in his business strategy. He insists on strict API licensing with partners to legally sever liability, basically creating a true arm's-length dynamic. He's building an architecture of caveat vendor, let the seller beware, where liability is perfectly partitioned. He treats partners purely as OEMs or resellers, making absolutely sure that if something goes wrong, the blame and the legal consequences are entirely contained. It's this fascinating defense mechanism, right? He's using the strict rules of software licensing to protect himself in ways the broader legal system currently hasn't.
And this strict mindset, it bleeds directly into his technology. Kyle is tackling what's known as the DUI credential battleground, using cryptographic hashes to ensure what he calls verified compute. Going even deeper than that, he wants to eliminate non-determinism in computer processors. To put it simply, he argues that modern computers essentially guess at math at a microscopic level when handling floating-point arithmetic. That creates a tiny bit of ambiguity in how software behaves. He wants zero ambiguity, none, both in computer code and legal code. He believes that if you can mathematically prove exactly what a computer did, you can legally prove who is responsible for it. It's all about forcing absolute accountability into the digital systems running our lives.
But you have to wonder, how do micro-level tech disputes and personal estate battles lead a technologist to take on the fundamental laws of an entire nation? Like, how do you pivot from securing API keys to challenging the Constitution?
Well, that brings us to Section 3, Canada's property rights gap.
Kyle's colleague highlighted a critical historical realization that really frames this entire legal crusade. Back in the 1980s, a political compromise essentially excluded strong property rights from the Canadian Constitution. Fast forward to the modern day, and that gap is still there, leaving massive vulnerabilities in property ownership for everyday citizens. We aren't just talking about high-level technologists here. This means the constitutional protections guarding the homes, businesses, and assets of ordinary Canadians are notably weaker than in a lot of peer nations. And right now, we're seeing a recognized revival to fight for those missing rights.
When presented this argument regarding the 1980s political compromise, it totally validated Kyle's worldview. He asserts that this systemic failure is exactly why he feels stripped of his property and his estate in the first place. He isn't just fighting bad actors or localized disputes anymore. He genuinely believes he's fighting a fundamentally flawed legal operating system. The lack of entrenched property rights, in his view, is the literal root cause of the vulnerability he and his family experienced.
And this is where things get really ambitious. Section 4, proposing a charter challenge.
Kyle's ultimate legal remedy is a charter challenge. If you're not familiar, this is a massive legal mechanism used to reform or strike down government laws that violate constitutional rights. He intends to marry Canadian and American constitutional philosophies to force a reform of these missing property rights. Specifically, he's approaching this as a textualist, viewing a living tree document. Basically, the living tree doctrine is the idea that a constitution is organic and has to adapt to new realities over time. Kyle wants to leverage that adaptability to finally graft ironclad property rights into the Canadian legal framework, a step he sees as absolutely necessary to manifest what he calls legal abundance.
Kyle believes technologists must act as the white blood cells of society, actively fighting systemic legal infections. And his strategy for doing this relies on legal engineering, specifically blending constitutional law with Ricardian contracts. A Ricardian contract is essentially a legal agreement formatted to be read both by humans as a standard text document and by computer software as executable code. By establishing absolute, cryptographically secure chains of title using this dual-layered approach, he wants to secure the metaphysical ledger. That ledger is simply the undeniable, underlying truth of who owns what. He believes this bedrock of mathematical and legal accountability will ultimately force the constitutional change he's seeking.
So what actually happens when technologists use constitutional challenges to redefine the boundaries of property and liability? Kyle McLean Smith's journey from fighting for his personal estate to proposing a Canadian charter challenge shows this wild collision between software engineering and legal formalism. As we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this to chew on. What does the future of our legal landscape look like when founders try to literally recode the constitutional systems we all live under? It is a massive undertaking and one that absolutely redefines the term disruption.